The Resilient Living Program, for those of you who are new to it, is a new program here at the IFOPA. It started last year, and it's really focused on supporting the emotional and mental health of our families. That's the individual with FOP, the caregivers, the siblings, really the entire support network for our community. So I wanted to start by just noting that the Resilient Living Program is really intended to be more of a proactive tool to support our community and their ability to handle life stressors. So I just want to say that this is not a substitute for seeking out help from a licensed clinical mental health clinician if you're suffering from a mental health disorder. The intention is really that by practicing the faucets and the skills that we're going to explore over this series, you are kind of putting in place a practice that will help prevent you from, being burdened by so many of the stressors that we all face on a day-to-day basis. And I wanted to tell you a little bit more about what this training is and what it is not. So it is really geared towards our adult community members, and that's just because it's not open to kids to join on our webinar. Not this time. I would love to explore the idea of doing, more of a kid-focused curriculum and doing something like that in the future. But right now we start with the adults, and that's really for a couple of reasons. One, because we know that adults have to be able to take care of themselves before they can take care of others. So, if you're kind of the glass, there's like the analogy of a pitcher in a glass, and if your glass isn't full, then you're not able to pour your love or your energy into other people. And so this is really focused on taking care of our adults in our community, especially our caregivers in that way. This training is going to cover each of the 10 faucets of the Resilient Living Core over the next 10 months. So they are separate series. You don't have to attend one to attend the next necessarily, but I think it is helpful to know that there is a foundation of knowledge that several of the faucets are building off of. So we're going to talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system and about how stress impacts us physically. And I think that's important to know for, throughout the series. It's more closely related to some aspects or some faucets than others, but there is, I would just say, some knowledge that carries over and an understanding of how each of the faucets impact each other. So that's something we'll discuss more as we're exploring each of those, but I just wanted to be upfront and say you don't have to attend every session to be able to enjoy the next one necessarily. And then I try to make this training as specific and relevant to the community as possible. So we'll try to discuss some of the ways that this resilient living framework is really helpful in an FOP specific way, but it's also going to address stressors that are completely unrelated to FOP, because we know that everyone experiences stress, regardless of if you have a diagnosis or not. And lastly, this training is interactive. So, just from sort of different learning style background or perspective, we know that some people do really well just listening to presentations and absorbing information that's told or shared with them. Some people like to read, and I have materials that you all will be getting in the mail soon. But then some people need more of a discussion-based style to be able to really absorb and understand information. And a lot of the exercises that come along with this information are interactive. There's something that you discuss in order to not only be able to kind of process things, but to learn from one another. So at the end of the sort of first half of lecture or presentation style, there'll be more of a group discussion, and we'll practice some of the new techniques that I'll be explaining, and then we'll have the opportunity not only for you to discuss those as a group, but the hope is that you'll be able to take those techniques back to your family or to your significant other and discuss and share some of those new practices you've learned with them. So I did just want to let everyone know that this first half of presentation style is being recorded, just so that other members of the community who are unable to log on and join us at this time can go back and kind of watch this little mini series. The recording will end right at the end of my presentation. So before we do any sort of interactive workshop or sharing, I will stop the recording and that will not be posted online, because I think there is some sensitive and personal information that can come up when we're talking about resilience and mental health in general. And I want to be respectful of all of you if you're willing to share that. So just to let everyone know that I am recording this, but the first half of this, but the more personal interactive components will not be recorded. So I'm going to start by just looking at resilience from a larger perspective. And I think it can be a really vague or abstract term for a lot of people. So, I think it's just important to cover what is resilience in general. And we're going to talk just about the basics today and of what resilience is. And then in the next 9 sessions, we'll sort of build off of this foundation with a more complex concepts that make up the resilient living framework. So we will certainly be diving deeper into this in the future, but right now I just wanted to start with sort of a broader understanding. So resilience is you. Before we go into more of the concrete definitions of resilience, I wanted to start by just acknowledging that just by logging on or deciding to opt into this educational series, you are resilient in so many ways. And so this training is really geared to help you learn new skills that will make you even more resilient. But I hope everyone can kind of pat themselves on the back and start by just acknowledging that you're already doing an amazing job by seeking out information and coping with the life stressors. So resilience is about bouncing back and recovering from life's challenges. People say that any stressor is something that can require your energy to recover from. So it's really working through the unpleasant feelings that we have in relation to distressing situations rather than avoiding them. And it's about knowing how to hit the reset button to do that as quickly as possible. So it's not about just, I guess, having like a rose-colored glasses and completely, shining over everything. It is really acknowledging that you're experiencing those unpleasant feelings and being able to move through that as quickly as possible. And a researcher named Richard Deinster actually proved that this was an effective way of promoting self-help or of being healthy through a study where he found that people who reacted strongly to stressors but recovered quickly were much more resilient by people who didn't react at all. So just to kind of reemphasize that stress without recovery is very damaging. So it's not that we're just kind of, glassing over the stress, but that we're acknowledging it and confronting it and working through it quickly, as opposed to just glancing over it. And I think that with a more abstract term, it can also be helpful to define it by talking about what resilience is not. So I wanted to point out that resilience is not a singular entity we're born with. It's not, just one thing that you either have or you don't have. It's a collection of skills and abilities. And, sort of like playing a video game, this is a skill. Resilience is a skill that can be practiced and is greatly improved over time. It is not achieved in one session, one training, or 1 month. So, while I would love, and it would be wonderful if this was so easy as to say, once you've, attended these 10 sessions, you'll be perfectly resilient and you'll never have to do a thing for another day in your life. It's not quite that easy. We know that it accumulates over time. So the more insight, we gain more insight as we overcome different challenges in life. And that helps us to increase our resilience. And it is a natural practice for everyone. So just like, I guess for some people, athletics, some people are naturally more athletically inclined. Some people have to work harder. Resilience, we're all capable of being resilient. So it may come more easily to some than others. But with practice, it can be learned and something we can be improved in. And it's not an all or none gain. So, any one improvement that you make in any one of the faucets we're going to talk about will increase your general resilience and your ability to bounce back. And I think I also want to emphasize, why it's important for us to focus on resilience. in our society, there is a lot that I think causes stress now than if you look back at just the way people lived decades ago. So some of the things we're going to talk about are specific to now, but just in general, we know that stress is an unavoidable part of life. So the term stress refers to demands that are made on our resources that may result in symptoms or breakdowns. So there's a lot of different demands that we all face. This sort of graph on the right showcases a few of them. It was from a study where they reached out to people and they found that for the average person, the top causes of stress are job pressure, money, health, or relationships. So that is just for people who aren't necessarily facing a medical diagnosis. And I think for our community in particular, there are things that will probably rank higher than job pressure or money. But I think this chart just kind of highlights that stress is something that everyone faces. And as I said, as an individual with FOP or as a caregiver, some of these things can be compounded. So in addition to a medical diagnosis, the societal trends that we face, which kind of can aggravate or increase our stress, are the information age that we live in, which causes us to, shift tasks constantly throughout the day, being in multitask overload. It has us more connected to screens. So the blue light, which can be really disruptful for our sleep-wake cycle. And then also just our connection to technology in general and the difficulty unplugging and finding some time to practice our own relaxation or self-calming practices can be more difficult. And one thing that I always like to point out at the end of the slide, because I think it can be really overwhelming to look at all of these things I don't want it to feel like all of these things are stacked against us, like the odds are not in our favor, because there are a lot of potential stressors out there. But the thing that's important to know is that no matter what happens, we understand that we can't control everything, but we can always control our ability to respond. So that's sort of just a nod to the idea that regardless of the situation, the control is really something that we try to hang on to and to focus on the power that has. So we're going to talk about that aspect or that faucet a lot more as we look at our sense of coherence skill later on. But I wanted to bring that up because I know that there's a lot of things on this list that can really seem to overwhelm people. So, in addition to just the inevitable presence of stress in our everyday life, I think it's important to acknowledge that stress has a very real physical impact on us. So, when we talk about self-calming next week, we are going to dive much more deeply into this impact of stress on our body. But it's all basically rooted in the autonomic nervous system. And I like to start by just giving a very basic, exploration into it so that hopefully it's not so overwhelming as we go more in depth into it in the future. But the autonomic nervous system has our parasympathetic nervous system and our sympathetic nervous system. So looking back at, kind of the caveman days, that sympathetic nervous system was the one that sent us into that flight, fight, or freeze response and all of the different physiological consequences that had on our body. It causes different parts of our body to receive more blood flow and our heart rate and our blood vessels to dilate. And so there's a lot of different physiological impacts for that. And if we are in that state for longer periods of time, it can have some really negative impacts for our body, for our heart health, our immune system, our metabolic system. It really does have a wide impact. So that's why our parasympathetic nervous system was there, and that is more of the brake side of the system. So after we go into that sympathetic nervous system response, this part, the parasympathetic, was supposed to help calm you down, or is supposed to help calm you down. So one form of stress, which is actually kind of a good form of stress, eustress, is the one that kicks in when we are about to undergo something exciting, such as a first date or a performance at work. And so that form of stress has us feeling really excited, and we have a really positive feelings about challenge and how vital we are in life. But if we're not able to work through that stress, so if that first date never ended or that performance never ended, then that those effects of that continued stress could be really negative. So that was sort of a look at the physiological impacts, but also there's a huge mental impact to stress. And so we know that when we're able to practice resilience or incorporate resilient skills, mentally we're able to think clearly and concentrate more easily. So, if you're under stress and you're at work and you're trying to get so many things from your plate there, off your plate there, you can have a really hard time concentrating because of the sort of overwhelming nature that you're experiencing due to the stress. So thinking clearly and concentrating, we're able to be more intuitive and better able to trust our guts, to feel more in control of our emotions and less critical, to find more meaning in life and be more optimistic, and just to have more fun. Even when life is hard, we're able to bounce back from those challenges and manage unexpected setbacks. So I think I've kind of made the case, hopefully, for why it's important to practice resilience or to be resilient, and why it's really important for us to hopefully study these 10 faucets. But you may be thinking, like, how am I going to do that? It seems like there's a lot of great stuff there, but with something that's a little bit less concrete, it's not like I can just go to the gym and do this exercise every day and then walk out perfectly resilient. So how are we going to make this happen? And there are 10 different faucets that kind of comprise the resilient living framework that we use. I'm going to go through each of them, but you will also obviously be learning a lot more about these in the coming sessions. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an understanding so that you have an idea of what we'll be talking about over time, and you'll see some of the interactions that are going to come into play between how different faucets impact one another. So the first one is practicing self-care, and the definition that I use to make the layman's term I think that I like to talk about is that, even if you're not able to sleep 8 hours or eat a perfectly healthy diet, it's important to find one method of practicing self-care that works for you and integrate that into your daily routine. So something we're going to talk about as we explore these different faucets is that, any one improvement you can make, if you're not going to the gym, eating perfectly healthy and sleeping 8 hours, that's okay. Just find one component of this faucet that works for you and try to start there or incorporate that. So exercise and self-care are grouped together through Turning Point, which is the organization that provided this framework to myself through the training. And for the FOP community, I know that exercise can be really difficult for some of the individuals with FOP. One resource that we're going to be implementing a lot throughout this year is energy medicine, and that is a form of movement that focuses on the meridians and the energy that we have in our body. So I hope that you'll stay tuned in to our social media posts, and I will definitely be sharing those energy medicine sort of tips and techniques through that, and then also on our website, so that you can kind of have a substitute to exercise if that's not something that works for your child with FOP. The ability to self-replenish is the second one that I want to talk about. So that is really recognizing, when you're running low. So if you think of our body as a tank, and when we are filled up, we have done a lot of things that make us feel really positive and have a good outlook. But when we've been experiencing stressor upon stressor, our tank can start to drop, and so you're running low. And I think it's important. One way to kind of promote this is to just check in with yourself every day. So whether it's just on the drive home from work or while you're waiting in line at the grocery store, to really stop and try to take a read on how your tank is sitting, so to speak, for that day, and to just gauge what your energy is and your mood is, because you may not have an opportunity at that moment to do something to fill yourself back up, but just that general awareness of where you are will probably impact, the things you're likely to commit to in terms of maybe a demand on your resource or your time from friends or extended family. So just taking that opportunity once a day to check in and really know where you're sitting in terms of the commitments that you'll make moving forward. The third facet that we're going to talk about is emotional expressiveness. So that's really a critical one. When we talk about emotional expressiveness, it's one of the core. And I think that really without emotional expressiveness, we're not able to do a lot of the other facets. So I would say this is definitely one of the building blocks or the foundation of this framework. And that is just a focus on first expressing rather than stuffing our emotions, and remembering that they're our body's way of helping our head and heart communicate. So, if we're not aware of our emotions, we're not able to really properly digest them, if you will, or express them or work through them. And without taking the time to acknowledge and work through them, a lot of times they remain sort of buried in our head or in our heart and can impact our ability to process our emotions in future occasions or just to live healthily in general. The fifth one, non-judgmental or self-supporting thoughts. So that is remembering to focus on finding the good in yourself in your situation. There's a lot of outside events, as we talked about. Stress is sort of unavoidable, but what's less important, or what's more important than that event, is remembering how we react to it will really help shape our reality. So the perception creates reality is the last sentence that I used to kind of summarize that one. And I think that's really key to just remembering the place of control we hold in situations. Optimism. So optimism and hope, which are the next two facets, are going to be combined when we discuss these, because I think they are very, they very interlocked, and they impact each other a lot. So the optimism aspect is remembering that it's not just enough to wish for something, but that when you have goals, you must define a plan to achieve them. And then, I'm sorry, I switched that one up. The optimism one is the focusing on the good in your situation. And hope is that it's not just enough to wish for something, but you must define your goals and have a plan to achieve them. So a lot of times you can be really optimistic, and it's good to focus on the good and to be aware of that. But without setting a plan in motion to try to attain your desired outcome, that the optimism can be kind of frustrating. So a lot of times we'll discuss, or in this training, we're going to discuss later, hope and optimism and how they work together. Hardiness is the placing of yourself at the center of the controls. So hardiness is a component that sort of runs throughout a lot of the other facets. It's a very basic, and I think it encompasses really the tenets of resilience, because it is placing yourself at the control, realizing that each of the potentially stressful situations you encounter is an opportunity for learning and growth. And then sense of coherence. This one is probably, I think, the most abstract of all of the facets we're going to talk about. So it can be one of the more difficult ones to really, I think, put a pulse on or your finger on. But sense of coherence is really focusing on the sense of order and on society as a larger picture, and where our place is in society, and how through society we can help find meaning. So the stress, the idea that in times of stress action eases despair, is really about just remembering that even though it may feel small to you, your actions do have a role within the bigger picture. And then social support. I think that this is one that our FOP community is especially strong in. If you're involved in any of our Facebook or social media pages, you know that our community is very interconnected, and that there's a lot of knowledge sharing and experience sharing that goes on there to help people feel supported. But one thing about social support that we're really going to talk about when we discuss this faucet is knowing that turning to people who you need when you need their support is important, but also remembering to reciprocate that support when they're in a time of need is key to keeping that relationship healthy. And then lastly, our ability to self-calm. So along with emotional expressiveness, I would say that this ability to self-calm is another really important one because once you've, sort of been able to label your emotions or identify them, you need to be able to work through them before you can really move on and de-escalate out of that stressful state. So the ability to self-calm is about recognizing the importance of self-calming and regulating our emotions and remembering that once our brain is calm, it's able to think much more clearly. So that is sort of a brief overview of the 10 faucets that we're going to be going through. And we're going to start off with some of the heavy hitters, the self-calm and the emotional expressiveness. And we'll end with the social support. I think that's one that we do so well that I like to kind of save that for last. But I would encourage you, if you aren't able to join on for the call for any one of these, it will be recorded. But also, if you think that committing to all 10 is a little too much, to kind of pick the ones that maybe you feel like you could use the most support in. Maybe you feel like you're already a very optimistic and hopeful person, and you want to set that one out in order to have more time to practice self-care that night or something. So just knowing what the schedule is, it is posted on the IFOPA website, and really being able to pick the ones that you feel like are most helpful to you, remembering that self-calming and emotional expressiveness are pretty critical to being able to practice all the rest of these. So, we've gone through all 10 of those, and you probably have a lot swarming through your head right now. I wanted to kind of boil it back down to say, in 4 brief sentences, resilience requires feeling your true feelings. So that very basic understanding of digesting your emotions and acknowledging them and recognizing what you're feeling in that moment. And then sort of a nod to the self-calming, it's about quieting your emotional and your physical reactions, because we know that our emotions impact our body, and that prolonged impact can have really negative consequences on our health. And then once you've done that, it's really about being able to restructure your thought patterns and filling yourself up through the positive experiences. So the analogy of the tank, if your tank is full, you'll be able to better bounce back and to be able to restructure your thought patterns in the future. It's a very cyclical thing where, being able to practice these things, even when you're not necessarily being exposed to stress or you're not in a stressful situation, is helping you fill your tank up and build up your resources so that when you are going through a stressor or when you're experiencing multiple stressors at a time, you've kind of done the work, the legwork ahead of time to be able to put yourself in a good position, or as good a position as possible, to handle those stressors. So that is more of the lecture style for today, or the lecture portion for today. I apologize if it doesn't feel as concrete. I think it's important to take this first session to really help everyone understand what it is we're aiming to achieve through the next 9 and what it is we're hoping to get from looking at each of these faucets. But it is a little more difficult because we're not focusing on any one faucet and any one skill or exercise to practice one of those 10 faucets. So I hope that you all will walk away with a really good direction on where we're going. But